Hey, in this video, we're going to find out why should we use Spring. So Spring in a nutshell, basically Spring is a very popular framework for building enterprise Java applications. When Spring first came out, it was initially a simpler, lightweight alternative to J2EE. They basically give you a large number of helper classes to make enterprise development easier. But now you may wonder, well, what about J2EE or Java EE? And here they have client-side presentation. They talk about server-side presentation with JSP, servlets, XML, and web services. They also discuss the idea of server-side business logic using enterprise Java Beans, web services, and so on, and all talking to a back-end database. And this all looks really good on paper. And as the developers, we were very excited when we saw this, viewing it on paper. But what happened is that when we actually got into the implementation details, it was another story. And I'll talk more about that in a second. All right, so how did J2EE grow up? Well, in the early days, it started out really nice. You had servlets, JSPs back in 1999. You also had enterprise Java Beans, Java Message Service, and RMI remote method invocation. And then over the years, they added more support for EJB with 1.3. They added, in J2EE 1.4, they added web services. And Java EE5, they kind of renamed it a bit. So it's Java Enterprise Edition 5. They dropped the J2EE thing. And they added some ease of use for EJB3, JPA, JSF, JAXB, and JAX WS for web services. And then with EE6, again, they pruned, meaning they got rid of some stuff that didn't work, mainly some of the EJB problems. And also they made it easier to use, so on and so forth. They added support for CDI, context dependency injection. And then finally in Java EE7, they added support for JMS version 2, batch, concurrency, WebSockets, and so on. So that's kind of how J2EE grew up over time. So serverless and JSPs were like the initial popular items, and then they started adding other things along the way. Now, the one thing they added along the way was enterprise Java Beans. And so EJB is like your cousin or your family member that you just don't really like because they just mess things up for everybody. So the early versions of enterprise Java Beans, versions 1 and 2, were extremely complex to develop. You had to create these XML deployment descriptors. You had to define multiple interfaces. So like we have in this diagram here, to create a bean class, you had to have a home interface and then a component interface. And you basically had like 3 or 4 .java files just for an actual bean implementation. So just a lot of work. It was really clunky for a developer to write all of this code. It was very tedious and very error prone. But once you finally got the bean developed and deployed it, and you deployed it in production, then you were slapped with another problem: poor performance. So these entity beans, basically mappings between Java classes and database tables, just awful, slow, just terribly slow. Like we actually had to do on one deployment, we actually had to pull our code back out of the production and actually remove the EJB functionality because it slowed everything down. And so what happened over time is that a lot of developers started to continue to do J2EE, but they actually would do it without enterprise Java Beans. And so this kind of caught on with other development teams too, and pretty much a lot of folks were doing it. So this one fellow, Rod Johnson, he actually wrote this great book called J2EE Development Without EJB. Okay, so EJB was very popular at one point, and then it fell out of favor. And so he pushed that out, and they also started working on the Spring framework. And so they released another book, Java Development with the Spring Framework. So EJB was kind of like that bad cousin or that bad uncle that you just didn't want in the family because they messed it up for everybody.